This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
Hello everyone. Ross, thank you. Welcome to Parliament House, Canberra. It's a very beautiful building. Gleaming architecture of glass, stone and wood. Magnificent artwork everywhere. Grass on the roof. The soaring flagpole. All these elements are uniquely Australian. They speak of our extraordinary land and our wonderful, quirky, diverse people. But it isn't all beauty and symbolism. This building is also extremely functional. It's here, in this structure, that many of the most important decisions that shape our country are made. In the parliamentary chambers, politicians vigorously debate and then vote on legislation. In the hundreds of offices that line the corridors, politicians and their staff strategise, negotiate, compromise and scheme. And the recent decapitation of Kevin Rudd shows us all that these processes can take place at lightning speed. Everything that takes place in this building is of course only possible because way back in the late 19th century, our constitutional fathers and mothers spent 10 years hammering out the exact wording of our national constitution. Over a decade there were heated arguments and many redrafts. The result? A document that forms the skeleton around which the body of our nation lives. Without the Commonwealth Constitution, this building in which we sit wouldn't exist. There would be no national parliament. There would be no city of Canberra. There would be no nation of Australia, which spreads from the Pacific to the Indian Oceans. As Ross pointed out a moment ago, the Constitution is indeed our national birth certificate, but it doesn't sit in the bottom drawer. The Constitution isn't a static historic document. The analogy I can think of giving you is it's not the shipping yard from which our country set sail back in 1901. Rather, it's the grand ocean liner in which we continue to travel. On a daily basis, it keeps us afloat. It's what binds us together and what determines how we interact. Throughout its 110 years, the Constitution has been centre stage in national life, even though we may not have realised it. As times change and situations emerge, judges and politicians must constantly return to the words of the Constitution to interpret their meaning. And the Australian electorate has been asked 44 times to vote on amendments. This process has resulted in 8 changes to our Constitution. It's a living, breathing document. And as part of the celebrations of National Constitution Day, the National Archives has organised this evening's event, a forum titled A Constitution for All Australians. Tonight, 4 prominent Australians will put their views on Australia's most important document. Former High Court Judge, the Honourable Michael Kirby, Professor of Law and Indigenous Studies at the University of Technology in Sydney, Larissa Behrendt, Vice-Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University, Professor Greg Craven, and former WA Premier and Federal MP, Professor Carmen Lawrence. Our first speaker this evening is constitutional lawyer Professor Greg Craven. He's the Vice-Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University. And during his career, he has held teaching and senior posts at 4 other Australian universities, Curtin and Notre Dame in WA, and also Monash and Melbourne in Victoria. He was also Crown Counsel to the Victorian Government in the early 1990s. Greg Craven has researched and written on constitutional law and history, public policy and federalism. He's a regular contributor to The Age, The Financial Review and, I must say gratefully, to the ABC as well. He was a leading advocate of republicanism in the 1999 referendum to change the Australian Constitution. His book, Conversations with the Constitution, Not Just a Piece of Paper, was published in 2004. Michael Kirby described it as, quote, a blunderbuss of a book. Craven is shocking, vulgar, over the top. Yet from his larrikin prose may emerge a heightened interest in the Constitution, which for most Australians is a black hole of ignorance and indifference. End quote. The title of Greg Craven's talk tonight is Australian Federalism, a Heroic Defence. Who better to kick off tonight's forum than a man who has conversations with our Constitution in a language that we can all understand. Please welcome Greg Craven.
Thank you. Well, I did quite consciously use the word heroic in the title of this presentation because I am perfectly aware that federalism is not the most popular concept in Australia. Especially in Canberra, where, as far as I can tell, centralism is your only common and interesting sexual fetish. I know that if you go to a party and you try introducing yourself with, "Hi, I'm Greg, let's talk about federalism," your sex life will be limited. But I am here to tell you that federalism is indeed a fundamental feature of our Constitution and one to be maintained at all costs. The other heroic aspect of this, which we all share, is we have to get through, in my case, a complete defence of federalism in 7 minutes. It takes a constitutional lawyer 7 minutes to draw breath, and I can only have the greatest sympathy for my friend Michael Kirby, who's been known to pause for up to 25 minutes between syllables in the same word. Moving on, I should say that, of course, I have now compounded the difficulty by introducing another horror by mentioning the word constitution. May I say two things about the Constitution, both of which are to say that it is a serious document, not the sort of horse and buggy administration that's commonly supposed as enshrining compulsory sobriety and the missionary position as a constitutional concept. It was firstly adopted by a referendum popularly by the people of the time. Yes, women didn't vote, but we're talking about 1900. It was written by elected delegates. It was finally approved by the population, and it is changeable today only by referendum. It is a document of great democratic legitimacy. The second thing I'd say is that it is the Constitution that has, whether we like it or not, and whether we think it perfect or not, provided us with 100 years of safe, stable, not perfect, but safe and stable democracy. And how many other places and countries can that be said of? Sweden, good ice cream. New Zealand, who cares? And so forth. And may I say, I greatly prefer the tourism of the country of so forth to New Zealand. And we have to remember that it is federalism that is indeed the fundamental feature of this democratic and brilliantly successful constitution. We also have to understand that, of course, the whole debate about abolishing the states is absolutely hypothetical because, and I hate to break it to you, which is a lawyer's way of saying I'm really enjoying saying this, there is no way you will ever abolish them, because it would require a national vote and a vote in every single one of the 6 states, which is about as likely as Tony Abbott being on the leading float at next year's Mardi Gras. So federalism is here to stay and is a question of how we make the best of it. Now, why is it that I have this great love for federalism? I mean, there are many psychological reasons, but to give you one that might make some sense, it has to do with power. That my view is that power is a dangerous concept and absolute power is a deadly concept. If one wants to be frightened of power, one only has to think back to what happened in this House last week. As I was saying to Carmen Lawrence, and this will give you an idea of how perceptive I am, I was in Julia Gillard's office with her Chief of Staff for an hour between 10 and 11 that day and noticed nothing wrong. So you can trust me when I tell you about federalism. Now, basically, the fundamental thing about this is, do you want a country where one government can do anything it likes, anywhere, at any time? Does that strike you as a safe way to deal with power? Or can you in fact imagine the situation that you would get of something like the New South Wales government currently coast to coast without restraint, a sort of constitutional equivalent of Lindsay Lohan? The great advantage of federalism is that it divides power. Separation of powers divides power analytically, federalism divides it geographically, and this is not theory but fact. Probably the 2 greatest potential mistakes in this country's history. One, the nationalisation of the banks by the Chifley government. The other, even worse, the proposed dissolution of the Communist Party of Arthur Menzies' government, stopped by the division of power federally. Now, there are many other arguments you can run in favour of federalism. I happen to believe in local democracy. In Europe, that's called subsidiarity. It sounds quite sexy. In Australia, it says, well, if you're going to decide what the water is like in Adelaide, then you may as well at least be a poor bastard who has to live there. I think probably decisions about the urban platypus in Melbourne are better made in Melbourne than Canberra. I probably think that there is quite a good argument that trial policy solutions in 6 states is better than one policy solution around the world. I know the Victorians think they're the Athenians of the Australian Federation, and I suppose they're right because they did bring the compulsory seatbelt to the world. And unlike some people, I do understand that there is a real difference, having lived in both places, between the policy problems of Victoria and Western Australia. And if you have any doubts on that matter, there are 3 very big men called Ken in Fremantle that I can introduce you to, and they will explain it to you in brutal terms. I think also we should be very, very careful about some of the arguments in favour of abolishing the states. They're generally accepted, I think, but unconvincing and shallow, rather like television soap operas or Senator Fielding. That we have too many layers of government when virtually every country has more than one layer of government. That we have too many bureaucrats when comparatively we have no more than anywhere else. And in actual fact, if Canberra took over, we would probably have more bureaucrats at more pay. They'd just be running the country from Canberra. That uniformity is good, but so often we get the lowest common denominator, not the highest common denominator. We want the English course from Melbourne, but we actually get the physics course from Tasmania, which consists of 3 semesters of learning to stand upright. That regional governments are an alternative, they certainly are. They're so small and powerless they can't stand up to Canberra. And that the states are artificial lines with no existence. If you cannot understand that New South Wales is older than the French Republic and that Fremantle is in Western Australia and not Queensland, then you are not in need of a constitutional lawyer, you need a psychiatrist. And so may I conclude on this point by saying this. Federalism restrains all power, even my power, if I'm in power. It forces discussion, it forces discourse, it forces compromise, and it forces engagement. Centralism looks good if you're in power, while you're in power, but not when Barnaby Joyce comes into power. It is the ultimate constitutional insurance. You pay something in complication and even in cost, but not everything can go wrong everywhere at the same time. Or to put it another way, the Constitution will not burn down in a federation, even if Peter Garrett is in charge.
Greg, you mentioned that the people in Adelaide are best placed to to know what's best in terms of their water, but of course their water comes from somewhere else. And I think everybody here would agree that the way we handle water has been a calamity. And I'm wondering, how does that example actually fit in with your argument?
It's quite interesting. For a start off, I'd say that the Commonwealth's had a lot of power to deal with water for a long time that it hasn't used because it hasn't wanted to. So it's not quite as simple as people think. I was actually really thinking of, we're talking South Australians here, I was thinking of the simple act like drinking rather than something as complicated as actually procuring water. But I think it's that fundamental idea of federation. There are some things which are national. Nobody wants a Victorian Navy, nobody's interested in a Queensland Army, and there are some things that are not national, they're local, like the platypus of Melbourne and like whether or not you supply water at what money in Adelaide. And it's a question of drawing the distinction between the two. I do believe in that European idea of subsidiarity, that it is a principle that matters should be dealt with so far as possible at the point closest to those who will be most affected by the decision.
You've given a passionate defence of robust federalism and what it can offer us. But in today's Australia, just how robust is federalism? Out of 10, how would you rate the health of this federal structure that you support so passionately?
You probably, it depends, do you want a numeric? I mean, I'd either rate it as sort of the Canberra Raiders or 2 out of 10. Probably about the same thing. The reality is federalism is not particularly healthy. There are elements of health that we haven't talked about. I mean, not all federalism is a disaster. There is cooperative federalism. Occasionally people come together, they try and agree and it works. There is no doubt that Australia as a federation is becoming one of the most centralised federations of the type that we are. I don't think, however, that's an argument for becoming more centralised. I'd say it's an argument for clinging to those elements of diversity that we do genuinely continue to have.
Greg Craven, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Our next speaker is Carmen Lawrence. Professor Carmen Lawrence has had a long and distinguished career in academia and politics in both the state and the federal levels. We all know her as the former Premier of WA and the first female Premier in Australia. She was in the WA Parliament for 8 years, serving 3 years as Premier. After state politics, she went on to serve at the federal level for 14 years as the member for Fremantle. During the Keating administration, she served as Minister for Human Services and Health and as Minister assisting the Prime Minister for the status of women. Later, she held several shadow portfolios. Prior to commencing in politics in 1986, Carmen Lawrence taught and conducted research. She trained as a research psychologist and has a PhD from the University of WA. After leaving politics, she returned to the UWA, where she's now a professorial fellow in the School of Psychology and director of the Centre for the Study of Social Change. The title of her talk is a feisty one. Should the Constitution protect the states from annihilation? She advises she will look at the erosion of the Australian states as a result of the arrogation of power and finances by the federal government and whether it matters. Former federal government minister Carmen Lawrence.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, except for the fact that I follow Greg Craven. That's never a pleasure. We've spoken together on enough occasions for me to know that I'd rather go before him than after him. Nonetheless, here I am. The only non-lawyer too amongst the speakers this evening, so those of you who are constitutional experts will forgive me. Like many Australians, I didn't read the Constitution until I had to. Probably I'm rare in having read it at all, and I'm not sure I remember a great many of its provisions except those that have proved relevant to my time in politics. I want to talk about what's happening to the states. Greg Craven's alluded to the fact that maybe the Federation's not in very good shape. The demise of the states has been anticipated for a long time. I remember following a typical and unsatisfactory negotiation with the Commonwealth about West Australia's revenue share. This is in the early 90s. The Honourable Joe Berenson, who was then West Australia's Attorney-General and Minister for Finance, told me that the states would, for all intents and purposes, he predicted, be no more than branch offices for the Commonwealth within 30 years. I think he's about right on that. Very prescient. Some have already pronounced the Federation pretty much dead, or at least looking decidedly unwell. UQ Professor of Public Administration Ken Wiltshire wrote in 2008, and I quote, that Australia is no longer a true federation because the states have lost their de facto sovereignty. Instead, we now have a national polity with a virtually unitary system of governance. Politics has been transformed and power has clearly shifted to the national arena. Each of the major political parties are now centralists. And I believe I've observed that process over the last 20 years. And I have to say the Australian community, I think unfortunately, seems increasingly to hold the view that the states in their current form don't actually perform a useful role, and the Federation requires a major overhaul, even to the abolition of the states. A poll commissioned by researchers involved in the Australian Constitutional Values Survey showed that in 2008, 30% of Australians, perhaps not surprisingly 40% in New South Wales, actually supported abolishing state governments altogether. A figure that had increased to 39% by 2010, so it's growing. The same survey shows that general dissatisfaction with the states is substantial and growing, and it's only in Western Australia where state governments are viewed as more effective than the national government. Such sentiments appear to have given even greater incentive to recent federal governments of both political stripes to accelerate their appropriation of what were formerly state responsibilities. And I want to take you back a little while. It wasn't meant to be this way. The Constitution was actually devised to protect the states. They envisioned, the framers of the Constitution, a balanced federal system in which the states would be permanent and significant players with meaningful power. They weren't just meant to be branch officers, as it was put, I think, once by Tony Abbott. The provisions they crafted were also clearly intended to ensure that the states wouldn't be subordinate to the national government. Those aspirations, I have to say, have been steadily eroded, and it's fair to say now that the federal structure now looks very fragile. It may be, as some have suggested, that we're actually witnessing right now the death throes of the states as anything other than service providers. This situation has developed, as I say, despite the various provisions which were explicitly designed to ensure the states a substantial and continuing role. If you remember, the colonies got together, they were determined to protect themselves. The equal numbers of senators given to the original states, for instance, the so-called States House, which the Senate clearly is not. The fact that it's the Commonwealth's powers that are defined in the Constitution, with the very substantial remainder theoretically going to the states. The provisions of various sections 106, 7 and 8 in particular, which are basically designed to ensure the maintenance of the states in perpetuity, and of course various provisions in the Constitution whose deliberate purpose was to protect the financial health of the states after federation. I'm just aware of the fact that you might be getting some funny sound up there coming and going. Is that... no, not a perception, it's just me. That could be the several hours I spent on planes today. Despite these very considerable protective manoeuvres, over the last 100 years, the national government's power has increased exponentially as it's exercised greater control over the nation's finances, and the states have become increasingly dependent on grants from the Commonwealth. High Court decisions, of course, have generally favoured the central government in critical areas, most recently in the case of industrial relations legislation that was introduced by the Howard government. And international events, such as climate change, for instance, have also tended to push the pressure for national rather than regional responses. Failure of the states, too, to reach agreement on solutions to problems across state borders, and we've already heard mention of the Murray-Darling River system, and dissatisfaction by citizens about state service provision in areas like health and education, dissatisfaction fed, I think, often by the media and wrongly, have stimulated community pressure for national responses allegedly free of contamination by parochial interests. Competition too, and I think this shouldn't be underestimated, for profile and voter approval have also driven greater Commonwealth interest in policy areas that were previously the province of the states, schooling being an obvious example. In recent history, of course, you'll remember the states were famously required to provide fully functioning flagpoles to be eligible for additional school funding. The intrusion of the Commonwealth in this area is without precedent, I think. High levels of mobility, too, in the Australian community mean that state affiliations are more fragile. Most of the people who live in Western Australia now came from somewhere else. And people have become more impatient with what appear to be arbitrary differences in policies, laws and regulations between jurisdictions. And a lot of constitutional experts have observed, probably some in this audience, that much of the erosion of states' powers has resulted from increasing control of the purse. And I won't go into that in detail, we can perhaps talk about it a little later. But as Premier and Treasurer, it was galling, and indeed one of the reasons that led to the formation of COAG, the Australian government's group, under Hawke, was that the Premiers, of whom I was one, were very impatient with finding the information about what they were to receive for the coming financial year and beyond shoved under their doors early in the morning before the meeting was to take place. That's not myth, it's fact. So having a discussion, any sensible kind of discussion about future budget was simply impossible in that circumstance. So the control of the purse strings has been critical. There are, as Greg Craven has mentioned, a great many reasons for us, I think, to protect the states, particularly in relation to the centralisation of power. But look at the international evidence, and I won't do that, but it shows very clearly that federations perform very well, economically and in terms of the sharing of power. Toomey and Withers, in their piece of work, ask why it is that Australians treat federation so dismissively, as they say, when the rest of the world sees the many advantages of federalism and decentralisation of power. It's a good question, and I, for one, don't know the answer. Thank you.
Carmen Lawrence, your perspective is a very, very interesting one because you've been both a state premier and also a federal minister, so you've seen things from both sides of the fence. And you just made a comment just a moment ago about what it was like. I think you used the word galling when you described your interactions with the federal government when you were premier. But I want you to put on your hat as a federal minister and maybe your hand on your heart and tell me whether or not at times when you worked in federal parliament, whether you ever felt that the states were hindering an important national agenda.
Honestly, I don't think I ever did. I think that some of them were recalcitrant, to use a word that a former Prime Minister used, not about the states, but he might well have. But the Commonwealth had a role to initiate interesting policy ideas in much the same way as the best of the states did. And there were times when they didn't take up what we thought were good ideas. Indigenous health is a good example, for which the Commonwealth actually could claim reasonable responsibility but required the cooperation of the states. So yes, it wasn't always easy to get cooperation, but I always regarded it, I guess perhaps because of my experience at a state level, as fundamental to achieving the best outcomes. That ultimately these policies weren't going to succeed if they were driven out of what were essentially desk-top policy developments out of Canberra. They actually had to be experienced on the ground. And most of the people with experience in service delivery were in state and local governments, not in the national government. So I think I was quite well aware of the limitations of the Commonwealth bureaucracy, if I can put it that way, in service delivery. And I think recent events have probably borne that out.
Very interesting. When you were a member of the Parliament, the House of Representatives here, did you ever think, gee whiz, as a West Australian, I don't think this is such a great idea, but as a member of an ALP government, I'm just going to have to toe the line?
Yeah, a couple of times, including in relation to forest policy. I was famously called a liar by one of my cabinet colleagues when I identified what I knew to be an area of forest that should be protected under the regional forest agreements but was about to be nominated as potentially destroyed under the agreement. The minister responsible, I won't name him, decided that he would show that I was wrong, flew to Western Australia, famously put one of his legs up on a log and showed that this was a place that was going to be mown down. It was already degraded. Turned out he was in the wrong place. If he'd known Western Australia, he wouldn't have gone to the wrong place. So that was a bit of a classic case, in fact, of local knowledge being, in his case, too little of it, a dangerous thing.
Cameron Lawrence, thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Michael Kirby. Michael Kirby has had a long and distinguished career in the law. At the time of his retirement last year, he was Australia's longest-serving judge. He was on the bench of the High Court of Australia for 14 years. Before that, he was president of the New South Wales Court of Appeal for 12 years. In 1975, he set up the Australian Law Reform Commission. He's also served in various international and United Nations capacities, and he continues to do so. And he is a prolific and compelling writer and public speaker. He's received many, many honours, including the Companion of the Order of Australia. And just 2 weeks ago, the Gruber Foundation in New York named him co-winner of the $500,000 Gruber Prize for Justice. He is the first Australian to receive this Justice Award. One final sentence, Michael. Michael Kirby is a passionate advocate for human rights. Tonight his topic is the Constitution as protector for fundamental human rights. It's a mixed story, he says, but we could do it better. The Honourable Michael Kirby.
And now for something different. So far, we've only heard about constructs, institutions, Commonwealth, states, local government, ways of organising things. I'm going to speak about something more important, the people of Australia, the rights of the people of Australia, the rights of the electors of Australia. And we saw a very good instance of the essential passivity of the people of Australia tonight, here with you. You were locked out. You were locked out of this room. The upper classes, the gentry in the front row, we were down here sipping our champagne and caviar, and you were out there locked out of the room. And did you storm the room as I urged you to do? I said, storm the room. Let us enter here, citizens. And did you do that? No. You all sat there or stood there, some of you in the cold of a Canberra night, and didn't even enter the Parliament's portals because the doors were locked. I mean, where is your spine? People of Australia, stand up. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Or did somebody say that before? Well, I'm going to talk about the fact that the Constitution of the Commonwealth doesn't contain what most constitutions in the world contain. No Bill of Rights. It was decided by the Founding Fathers. Sorry, Damien, no Founding Mothers. Look at the photos. Women excluded. No women at our constitutional conventions. If there'd been more women, there would have been more sense. And the rights of people would have been protected. But notwithstanding this default, it has to be said that sometimes in the embers of the Constitution, the High Court will find means to protect the rights of the people. And the first time I ever heard of the High Court was back in 1951. I was a boy of 11. My grandmother had remarried, and she'd married the national treasurer of the Australian Communist Party. It wasn't a good career move. Not in 1951. And he had the treasurer of the Communist Party, paltry though that was, and he had to go and hide because he was afraid he was going to get locked up. But as you know, the High Court of Australia struck it down by 5 justices to 1. One didn't participate. And that decision of the High Court was upheld in a referendum by the people of Australia. The people, when they had a chance, decided that they would not allow the taking away of people because of their ideas, however foolish their ideas may be. Of what they do, they could attack, but not what they thought, what they believed. The banking case, as has been mentioned, the case of poor people who are caught up in a trial, the case of McKinney and Judge, which held that if you were poor, not by choice, and you didn't afford a barrister, you would be assigned one by the state. The case of implied rights to free expression. The High Court, unremarkably, I think, said if you're going to have a constitution with an awful lot of provisions about electing the parliament, it has to be a real election. There has to be debate. You have to have a right to speak and to criticise and talk about political and economic matters. Not a big leap, terribly criticised at the time. That was in the Mason Court. They said there is an implied right to free speech that makes the parliamentary system work. And just before I left the High Court, there was a great case, little covered in our celebratory media, the media of infotainment that we have today that so abuses its powers and doesn't serve Australia well. And I'd exclude you, Damien Carrick, and the ABC. But the rights of prisoners to vote in this parliament, just near us, a few metres away from us, the parliament took away the rights of all prisoners to vote in this country. They are human beings, most of them are citizens, they are suffering their penalty in prison, but they're not losing their dignity, and the High Court of Australia held disproportional. You have to allow the prisoners to vote unless they're in prison for more than 3 years. We found many people are in prison because they can't afford to pay fines. And the High Court upheld the right to vote as something that was emerging from the implications of the democratic parliament. But for all that, we've seen other cases where the High Court hasn't been able to step in because there's no means in our Constitution for the court to give protection. In the case of Rupert Max Stewart, back in 1959, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. And the High Court ultimately said this is a very troubling case and things in it cause great grievance and terrible worry, and we're not sure that this is right, but there's no basis for us to protect him. He had given a confession to police which experts said was completely unreliable. Darcy Dugan, a man who was a prisoner, sought to sue for defamation. They said he is corrupted of the blood. No constitutional protection which could allow him to sue. He couldn't sue. He wasn't a person who could sue in court. The Mabo case wasn't decided by constitutional principles. It was decided by the High Court on common law principles. Then there was Combay in the High Court. Mr. Combay's case about political advertising. Now that's an interesting case. Political advertising which didn't have a specific appropriation. And in the High Court said, well, we can't interpret the powers over appropriation to protect the rights of the people to ensure that you don't spend money unless it's been carefully laid before the people and approved by the People's Parliament. Al-Kateb, where a man was locked up and under the law could be held indefinitely. The High Court said, well, there's by 4-3 that there's nothing we can do about that. That's what the law says. And for Aboriginal people, just before I left the court, the very last decision in which I participated, the Northern Territory intervention was challenged in the court, and by 6-1, with myself dissenting, the court said there's nothing we can do about it. A case designedly applying to the Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory of our country who were deprived of rights because they were Aboriginal people, and no consultation with them whatsoever before it was done. So there are a lot of things in our Constitution which are good, and there are many cases of which we can be proud. But there are other cases where we shouldn't be so proud. And when we look to minorities, when we look to Aboriginals, when we look to other minorities, gay minorities, the Parliament doesn't always protect the rights of minorities, and we should provide in our Constitution basic rights of equality, non-discrimination to protect all people in this country, high and low, large and small, powerful and not so powerful, against the abuse of power in parliaments.
Michael Kirby, a passionate argument in favour of a Bill of Rights. Bills or charters of rights come in various forms. You have the constitutionally entrenched Bill of Rights in the USA, and you have charters set out in legislation in places like the UK and New Zealand. What form would you advocate?
Well, that's a matter for proper consultation. It's not for me to say what the form should be. It should come from the people. I'm sick of this business of saying this is for the gurus and for the highly educated. It's a matter of consulting the people. Why do they line up in the cold of Washington, as Ross Gibbs told us here? They're proud of their Constitution. They're proud of the Bill of Rights in their Constitution. They're taught it in their schools. We don't teach civics in our schools. One of the good things that's come from the Victorian Charter of Rights is that the children at schools in Victoria are being taught that they have rights. I mean, you didn't know you had a right to enter this room. You were just standing there passively waiting for the doors to open. So, well, there should be a notion that we have rights as citizens, and that won't happen unless it's in our Constitution. Indeed, citizenship isn't there in our Constitution. British subject status is there. So there's a lot to be done, but it's not for me to say, it's for the people of Australia, properly consulted.
Michael Kirby, opponents of a bill or a charter of rights always argue that such an instrument will inevitably mean transferring power from elected parliaments to unelected judges.
I'll give us
people
a break,
like you.
Damien.
Is this a self-interested power grab?
This is a complete furphy. We have in our country judges who have had certain powers under the Constitution. Have they abused them? No, of course they haven't. And in other countries, in every other country of the world, virtually every other country of the world has bills of rights, and there is a constitutional conversation between the judges and the parliaments. This is a way by which minorities are protected. We didn't give Aboriginal people land rights in this country. It was not done of 150 years of democratically elected parliaments. We did not do it, and it was done ultimately by the High Court of Australia. And I think it was one of the proudest decisions of the court, one of the greatest decisions. What are the cases in the High Court that you're most proud of? The cases that looked after and protected the communists, and that looked after and protected Aboriginal Australians. And they were done by judges, and that's how it's done in every country of the world except us. It's time we really re-examined ourselves, especially for teaching human rights in schools to the next generation.
Michael Kirby, thank you. Our final speaker tonight is Professor Larissa Behrendt. She is the Professor of Law and Director of Research at the Jumbunna Indigenous House of Learning at the University of Technology in Sydney. A URLA Gamilaroi woman, Larissa trained in law and was admitted to the bar of the Supreme Court of the ACT and New South Wales. She's a pretty busy lady. She is a Land Commissioner at the New South Wales Land and Environment Court and the alternate chair of the Serious Offenders Review Board. She's also a member of several other boards and councils in law, academia and the arts. She too is the author of an impressive number of books, articles and papers on Indigenous legal issues, as well as 2 novels. She won the 2002 David Unaipon Award and the 2005 Commonwealth Writers' Prize for her debut novel, Home. Her latest novel, Legacy, was released in 2009. Also in 2009, she was named the NAIDOC Person of the Year. Larissa Behrendt argues that the decision of the framers of the Constitution to exclude human rights needs to be amended. The title of her talk tonight is Breaking the Silences in the Constitution. Larissa Behrendt, welcome.
Following Justice Kirby on the Constitution eclipses the time I had to follow on speech writing, a panel on speech writing. I came after Don Watson. It's certainly even a harder act than that. The framers of our Constitution had a blank slate, but were very much guided by their values and their vision of what Australia could be. This exercise of examining what the future of our country should be is one that we always need to be engaged with, as much now as we had to then. The actual text of our Constitution is dry and passionless. It's more likely to inspire sleep than patriotism. But it doesn't need to excite to play its role as the foundation for the type of community and the values we should have. At the time the Constitution was drafted, it was assumed that Aboriginal people were a dying race. Theories of white racial superiority were dominant. Aboriginal populations had been so depleted by the impact of colonisation that it was a popular view that the kindest thing that could be done for us was to provide places on government-administered reserves to live out our days with some dignity. These views influenced the choices made about the kind of constitution Australia should have, including the values that underpinned it. Vigorous discussion was had about the extent to which rights should be included in the text. There was a suggestion that a clause be included that would protect a small number of rights, including those to due process before the law and equality before the law. This suggestion was rejected because the framers of the Constitution thought that the questions of which rights were protected, how they were balanced, and the extent to which they were protected should be answered by the elected arm of government, the Parliament. But the exclusion of rights of equality before the law and due process were also influenced by the dominant ideologies of the time. It was thought desirable to be able to continue to make laws that regulated people of other races, particularly Aboriginal and Chinese populations. A further testament to the influence of this ideology was that the first legislation that passed through the Australian Parliament were the immigration laws that entrenched the White Australia policy. The Constitution left matters relating to Aboriginal people to the states and left the federal government with responsibility only for Aboriginal people in the territories. But Aboriginal people defied the expectations that we would die out and instead increased our numbers. Our exclusion from mainstream Australian life and its benefits, and the appalling conditions that existed on government-controlled reserves and in Aboriginal communities around the country, became an increasing national concern. And Aboriginal people continued to feel the impact of discriminatory practices and policies: dispossession, removal of children, the inability to access mainstream services and to earn a proper wage, regulation of the right to marry, and infringement of the freedom of movement. The impact of the lack of human rights protection is illustrated in the 1997 case of Kruger and the Commonwealth, where Aboriginal people claimed that the policy of removing children from their family infringed human rights, including those to due process before the law and equality before the law, also freedom of movement and freedom of religion. The High Court determined that the claim failed because the Australian law protected none of those rights. This case highlights the fact that many basic human rights that we might assume are protected by our legal system actually aren't. And it also highlights how the failure to protect human rights can have a disproportionate impact on those who are most likely to be negatively affected by government policy. Not surprisingly, Aboriginal people have seen constitutional change, including recognition of our unique status in a preamble, as an important part of the agenda to facilitate a new relationship with the Australian state. This was certainly the thinking behind the 1967 referendum, where it is clear from the campaign for a yes vote that it was assumed that transferring the power to make laws for Aboriginal people to the federal government would mean a new era of non-discrimination. Those expectations, however, have not been met. The 1998 case of Cartonieri and the Commonwealth concerned the building of a bridge over the Hindmarsh Island area. When traditional owners sought to prevent the construction over what they claimed was culturally significant land, the federal government sought to circumvent any opposition to the development by simply suspending the application of heritage protection legislation over that area, thus denying those traditional owners any mechanism for appeal. In challenging the government's actions, the traditional owners argued that when the 1967 referendum gave the federal government powers to make laws in relation to Aboriginal people, it was with the understanding that the powers would be used only to benefit Aboriginal people, not to take rights away, as was being done in this case. A majority of the High Court, Justice Kirby dissented, said that whatever the intention was when voters said yes to make the change to the Constitution, if the government now has the power to make a law to provide a benefit, it has the power to repeal it and take that benefit away. Reinforcing the fact that the government can repeal legislation that provides rights protection was the fact that the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act occurred at the same time as those heritage protection laws were suspended over Hindmarsh Island. It was one of only 3 occasions on which the Racial Discrimination Act has been suspended since it was brought into law in 1975. It was also suspended as part of the amendments to the Native Title Act by the Howard government in 1998, and it was suspended as part of the Northern Territory intervention. The suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act in relation to the Territory intervention highlights the way in which human rights violations continue to occur in Australia. While proponents of the intervention argued that it was acceptable to suspend rights to protect from racial discrimination in order to facilitate policies such as compulsory income quarantining, this tolerance of the suspension of one of our few protections of human rights overlooked the fact that it was not just the removal of the principle of freedom from racial discrimination from legislation and policies that occurred. It also deprived Aboriginal people of the very real right to make complaints to the Australian Human Rights Commission. This same package of legislation for the Northern Territory intervention also suspended rights to make complaints under anti-discrimination legislation in the Northern Territory and rights to appeal to the Social Security Appeals Tribunal. The total effect of the legislation was that any Aboriginal person subject to compulsory income management who felt that they were being unfairly treated or discriminated against had no avenue through which they could seek redress, no forum in Australia which could hear their concern. This is an extraordinary violation of the rights to due process and equality before the law. And this situation shows that human rights are not about abstract ideas, not merely a luxury for elites to pontificate about, but rights provide tangible, practical mechanisms for people who feel aggrieved to assert in order to claim some kind of redress to improve their situation. I believe that a National Bill of Rights would modernise our legal system, transforming it so it reflects our contemporary understanding of human rights that have developed in the post-World War II era. But the vulnerability of legislative rights protections is that they can be repealed or overridden when the Parliament decides it is necessary. So for this reason, I believe we should consider complementing a legislative Bill of Rights with the inclusion of 3 fundamental rights into the Constitution. These 3 rights would aim to cure the underlying racial prejudices that remain within the Constitution, but I think also embody the idea of fairness that most Australians would say is one of our inherent values. These 3 rights would be the right to due process before the law, the right to equality before the law, and the right to be free from racial discrimination. Thank you.
Congratulations, that was terrific.
Larissa Behrendt, you call for a preamble and a legislative Bill of Rights, and also for the inclusion of 3 constitutionally entrenched rights. those changes would require a referendum, I would imagine. And Larissa, we know that Australians, they very, very rarely vote for constitutional change. So would this be realistic, this idea of 3 constitutionally entrenched rights?
There's no doubt that the idea of constitutional change is an aspirational one because of the mechanisms that we require to make any alteration to the document. But I think the thing that makes those ambitions achievable is if you look at the support that occurred for the 1967 referendum. It was the most popular change. It had over 90% of Australians voting yes. It was had enjoyed bipartisan support and from a broad range of organisations within the community. And I think it goes to one of the issues that Justice Kirby spoke about before. It was a constitutional change that wasn't a technical change. It was a constitutional change that spoke to something that many Australians had a view about. And you can see by the sorts of slogans that were used in the campaign about say yes to the rights for Aboriginal people with pictures of young Aboriginal children on the posters that this was really an issue that captured the hearts and minds of the Australian people. It's very easy to be cynical about the level of support Aboriginal rights gets when you look at the way in which rights violations that occur, like those with the Northern Territory, are dismissed by Australians who would sort of say, well, at least something's happened, at least they're doing something over there. I'm not worried about these rights being suspended. It's easy to be cynical about that, but I think we have evidence of times when Australians have said, this is a matter that reflects on all of us. This is a matter of key national significance. I think if you could capture that, those sorts of changes could be possible.
Self-respect.
Sorry?
Self-respect. It's a matter of self-respect. Australians.
Yeah, I think so. And I guess part of the agenda that I'm asking for proposing with the issues of the Bill of Rights and those 3 particular rights that would go into the Constitution, you know, I would argue that they would have a disproportionately positive impact for Aboriginal people because we've been one of the groups that have been very vulnerable with the absence of those rights. But they're rights for all Australians. You know, they are rights that we all have. I wouldn't necessarily see that as having to be a debate about Aboriginal Australia.
You point out that the Constitution, this document that we're celebrating here tonight, it's at the heart of our nation. It's absolutely silent about Aboriginal occupation of this land for 40,000 years. What would a preamble which recognised that occupation of the land say? Do you have a sense of what it would actually say?
Well, we've had several debates in our history about that, and the issue of the preamble comes up in lots of moments where we as a country look at issues of constitutional reform. And certainly, you know, to be reflective of some of the views that have come out of consultations with the Aboriginal community about that question, there's a very strong sense that, first of all, the recognition should be of sovereignty, not just a peripheral thing. And there is a strong view that the preamble should have some weight when grey areas of the Constitution are being interpreted. You'll perhaps remember when the proposal for a preamble was put forward under Howard, it was with the stipulation that it couldn't be implemented. But I'd just make one final point about the issue of constitutional change. You can just see with the issue of a non-binding recognition in a preamble how contentious people feel the issue of the protection of Indigenous rights is in our Constitution. You compare that with the Canadian Constitution, where in 1983 they inserted a specific clause into their Constitution as part of their human rights improvements to their legal framework. And that clause just simply says Aboriginal and treaty rights are protected. I mean, in terms of where other international benchmarks sit on protection of Indigenous rights, we really fall way, way behind.
Larissa Brent, thank you. We're very fortunate this evening to have 4 very erudite minds here. 4 erudite minds who don't see eye to eye on some issues, and I'd like to tease out some of the differences in their perspectives. Greg Craven, I'd like to start with you. You've spoken about the role of politicians in corroding federalism, and you also wrote in your written version of this the paper that of the paper that you just gave before, not in your oral comments but in your written paper, you mentioned that the judges of the High Court, quote, gracefully gave way when faced with questions around federalism. Can you elaborate? Can you put that in blunter terms?
Yes. I think there's no doubt, and I don't think anyone would seriously argue that the High Court has presided over a decline in federalism in the same way as the Commonwealth itself has presided over a decline in federalism for a long time. Since 1920, in the Engineers case, you would be able to draw a more or less straight line in important terms, showing that the High Court generically, institutionally, over a long period of time, had a vision of Australia as a far more centralist country, and its decisions, ranging from Engineers itself through decisions around external affairs, the corporation's power, have consistently favoured that. There are occasional wins, to the states, like there are occasional wins to football teams, but they're statistically unimportant. I remember saying that if you want to look at the names of the great cases of the court, putting aside those couple or the rights cases, for example, that Michael Kirby was talking about, the great disasters of the states are written on the battle banners of the High Court in the same way as the great disasters of France are the battle honours on British flags. And you can see that. So I think the High Court, which was conceived by the founders as the keystone of the federal arch, which is what they called it, has, in my view, been a complete and utter failure. It's actually been a major force for centralisation.
Michael Kirby, can I ask for your thoughts?
What do you want me to say? I mean, I'm not here to defend the High Court's decisions over a whole century. I didn't agree with some of them myself. But Greg, you will have to agree that one of the finest defences of the utility, of the liberty-protecting features of federation was, in my dissenting opinion, in the Work Choices case and the unholy alliance with Justice Callanan.
Absolutely.
In that case. Federation it divides power, and that's not necessarily a bad thing in a century that concentrates power because of the technology and of the way modern economies work and so on. So. But that's water under the bridge, a battle lost, I'm afraid.
I asked before Carmen Lawrence to speak of her experience, and Michael Kirby, I'll ask you, as much as you're comfortable to speak of your own, the psychology of the High Court. It's the creation of the federal government, and it's based here in Canberra. And is it inevitable that the High Court will mostly take a Commonwealth-friendly stand because of its place here in Canberra and because of its place in the federal structure?
I don't think geography explains these things. I think it's a part of the emerging national identity. It was Justice Isaacs, really, in the Engineers case that Greg Craven has referred to, that took a highly literalistic approach to the Constitution. It would not have been legally irrelevant to say, well, you read the federal grant of power, but you read it down because it's in a federal constitution which conceives that there also have to be states with real powers and real existence. That wouldn't have been an irrational or unreasonable interpretation. But in the Engineers case, Isaacs, son of migrants, not living in Canberra, said, no, if the federal parliament has the power, that's it. No reading down, no implication of federalism. And that basically is the doctrine of the High Court that has been observed since 1921.
Carmen Lawrence, wearing your hat as State Premier, did you ever feel frustration following a decision of the High Court? Was that something that entered into your head? Was that something which was living for you and other State Premiers?
Certainly aware of the fact that over time, over the periods since Federation, there had been a steady movement toward greater Commonwealth powers in a range of areas, particularly in relation to trade and to industry, which had an effect when you put them side by side with sources of funds and revenue being controlled by the Commonwealth. which was sometimes the result of those decisions, but sometimes quite separate from it. I mean, the use of special purpose payments by successive governments, beginning with one of my heroes, Gough Whitlam, but the fact that those payments became a greater and greater proportion of the funds that were going to the states had less and less control over it. The GST is just the most recent example. So if I had to point to the forces that have made the states less independent, creative forces in the Federation, I'd point really to the fact that the funds are controlled often to a very sort of fastidious degree. So the accountability of the states under those special purpose payments has a whole bureaucracy of its own which is required to account. And then the ability for the states to respond in a way that is creative and takes account of local needs is hamstrung, I think. And that's the frustrating thing. Not that the states have power. I've never been interested in the state as an institution, but to the extent that it provides for its citizens and is better able to do so, as Greg Craven's indicated, when it's close to the source of both power and service delivery. That if you're in a state government and something goes wrong in a school, you can go and stand on the shirt tails of the minister. You can make life uncomfortable for them. There's a very interesting lesson, I think, in this recent catastrophe that we've seen with some states in school funding. Not all states, it has to be said, and it's interesting to look at it. There's been a very uneven performance by the states in the delivery of Commonwealth funds, and that should raise a whole lot of questions, I think, about the relationship between two governments. But I haven't seen anyone discuss it in those terms. No problems in Western Australia, huge problems in New South Wales.
And Damien, don't blame the judges only on these things, because the judges can't do anything unless a case comes to the court, and the case comes to the court because legislation has been enacted in this place. And therefore, all the judges can do is deal with the constitutionality or the interpretation of the law. But the real decisions have been made in this parliament over 110 years. And it's not the judges. The judges are reactive. The parliament is creative of great changes that have happened. And many of them have been good changes for how could we have fought the war, the Second War? How could we have fought it without a very great interpretation of the defence power? So it's horses for courses, but we shouldn't throw out the federal idea. That's the important thing. It's a liberty-protecting idea, and we've got to realise that.
Larissa Brent, I'm really interested to get an Indigenous perspective about this state versus federal paradigm. In your view, or in the view of Indigenous Australians, are state rights important? I mean, is this whole issue important?
Well, let me just give my perspective on that as a personal perspective, but working obviously coming at it from my work with Aboriginal Australia. The unintended consequence of the 1967 referendum, which gave power back to the federal government, was that it did split responsibility for Aboriginal affairs between the federal and state governments. And as a result, I think one of the biggest challenges that we have in dealing with Indigenous disadvantage in particular is the cost shifting that occurs between federal and state governments, which I think it's very, very much a feature of the Aboriginal affairs portfolio. It occurs in other areas, education, health, etc., where both levels of government seek to push the blame of failure of policy and the responsibility of resourcing onto the other side. So in key areas like health, education and housing, there is enormous underfunding of those issues. For example, the time of Rudd's election, funding on basic Indigenous health needs was underfunded by about $460 million. The time of the Northern Territory intervention, funding on housing was underfunded by about $2 billion just in the Territory alone. The coordination between federal and state governments around service provision becomes incredibly destructive in terms of getting stuff on the ground. Take, for example, as part of the Northern Territory intervention policy, there was a almost $700 million housing program set up. In 18 months, it delivered no houses. And part of the problem was the red tape between the two levels of government and then contracting out, etc., etc.
So are you advocating?
So when you look at it like that, the easy fix might be to say the split between governments doesn't work. But I think this is a bureaucratic problem. And I think it's really important because I think my answer to why federalism is important goes to the heart of the point that Greg Craven made about the fact that you need to have the balance between state and territory governments. I think a lot of our frustrations in practical matters as people who deal with governments is that this bureaucracy and the way bureaucracies work is really frustrating and a barrier to improvement. But I don't think that's an argument for getting rid of a federal system that in other ways has served us really well.
Well, we've been talking so far in our discussion about the federal-state balance. The other topic which has been the focus of this evening's discussion has been a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights. Greg Craven, a Charter of Rights is advocated by Michael Kirby and Larissa Behrendt. Do you think that's a good idea?
I knew you'd ask me that. This is really unfair because we're sort of split on everything else roughly evenly. I am the only person on this panel who would be opposed to a charter.
Might be surprised.
Oh, is that right? I'm ready to be surprised. Although interestingly, as we know, the federal government, or at least what was the federal government, recently rejected the finding of the Brennan inquiry by Professor Frank Brennan, who was in fact one of the professors of my own university. I say that partly because I think it puts it in context that there are two legitimate views on this. It's not just one view. People of goodwill can hold quite different views. Frank Brennan and I have discussion about this. The other reason I say it is because it's terribly important to me to say it because this is the only major constitutional issue on which I have ever been on the winning side. I'm a federalist and have been absolutely rolled with the states. I was one of the Republican referendum committee, and every time I see Michael, he reminds me that I was done like a dinner. On this one occasion, I seem to be in a majority. I think there is an argument against a bill or a Charter of Rights, and one can't just dismiss it, even though I have Michael Lavache staring viciously at me as I say it. And it's this, that in my way of thinking, the sort of issues that come up under charters and bills of rights, they're not legal issues. And they're not, how you decide property, they're not this bit of libel or slander or that bit of torts. They're fundamental policy issues about what life is, what equality is, what freedom of speech is. That's not law, that's policy. Now, my belief is that those types of policy issues have to be decided democratically. If you don't have those issues decided democratically, you don't have anything decided democratically. And that the way we do that is by elected parliaments. So when I hear Michael Kirby say, give it to the people, what I actually hear him say is, give it to the judges. That we're actually going from a position where these issues will be decided by people we elect to people who, however wise, we do not elect. I found it fascinating that with all of these arguments around bills and charters of rights, the desperation of their proponents not to put them to the referendum, as Larissa was, I think, very honestly advocating. And the reason you wouldn't put it to a referendum is you know that they would be absolutely butchered. I speak with experience. I'm an expert at losing referenda. The last time we had a referendum on rights, it got 26%. And those were for piddling little rights in 88. Put up equality and I think you'll establish a world record. And there are two other reasons that really worry me about them. One is that I think not only is it undemocratic, but I think judges are not expert in this. Judges are lawyers trained in the law. They're not trained in policy. That again is an issue for diverse elected parliaments. And the final thing that worries me enormously about it is the effect on the courts themselves. I fear that if the courts get into policy and the derivative of policy is politics, then they will be regarded as politicians by politicians. And when that happens, then the politicians will go for the courts, which I don't want to have happen. Now, I may be wrong on all of this, but it's not a view that's not shared, I think, among a wide number of Australians, and I don't think it's a disreputable view. May be wrong, not disreputable.
All this fear of the unknown. I mean, every other country has this.
Yes, they have rabies too, but I don't want to import that.
Why are we on our own on this? I mean, it's all very well if you're a white, heterosexual, male Australian, then you're quite content with the arrangement. If you're a woman who's seen the inequality, or if you're an Aboriginal, or if you're gay, or if you're disabled, We have no way whereby these people can work the political system. If you're a politician, if you've come up those greasy poles and you've got into politics, you don't want to share the power. That's the bottom line. And the value of Bills of Rights as they're found in Canada and in South Africa and in so many other countries of the world, the value of them is it gives little people the right to go to courts and get judges. And all that Professor Brennan suggested from your university was that there should be a way whereby the courts then say it's in breach of it, but it's up to Parliament to fix it. Now, what is undemocratic about that? My fellow citizens, what is undemocratic about that? That leaves it, the last word comes to this House. But that was too strong. Oh, we can't have that power to the judges. A lot of nonsense. It's greasy poles and power to those who've got up them.
A last word to Carmen Lawrence, who has promised to surprise us.
Well, I'm not necessarily against either of the arguments I've heard. Let me put it this way. Yes, come on. Let me put it this way. If you look at the actions that have succeeded in democracies with which we're familiar, including our own, they have really been legislated improvements in civil rights, civil and political rights. As an activist in the women's movement, being conscious of what happened with Indigenous people in this country, looking at the civil rights movement in the United States, you can take case after case after case. And law followed political activism in many cases. And in some cases, the law, in fact, made it extremely difficult. The Constitution didn't protect in the case of the United States. These changes need to be a mix of things. You have to have the popular support, you have to have activism that drives it. And so I'm actually in favour of having legislated rights. We already have them to some extent, limited extent, in anti-discrimination legislation, so that people can see how they operate. And not to be overly, I guess, impressed by the fact that individuals can take cases before courts. Not many people can do that. Many of the people whose rights are violated don't recognise that they are. So I think a momentum of civil, if you like, understanding and education and a greater commitment to rights from a whole range of sources, education, legislation in the parliaments, and if it were then finally kind of accepted by the community in Australia, a legislated Bill of Rights. That might be the point we get to, but I don't think we can go straight to that without a strong basis in Australian sentiment. And it has to be said, I don't think we have that now.
A final word, brief word, Larissa.
I think that we put too much focus when we talk about Bills of Rights on the role the judiciary plays in it. If you look at the Human Rights Act here in the ACT, and we do have two jurisdictions in Australia, the ACT and Victoria, who have charters of rights, the main impact of that charter in the ACT hasn't been cases being brought. There hasn't been a floodgate of cases. It hasn't been a lawyer's picnic. The biggest change has been that bureaucrats within the Canberra system now have to look at those rights when they make very simple policies, from traffic laws to make sure that there's a way that you can question a fine. If your licence is being lost and depriving you of an income, there is a right to due process. And similarly, legislation like the Sex Discrimination Act had a profound impact, not so much from cases, but because now almost every workplace in Australia has policies in place to make sure it's compliant with that legislation. So I think when we look at the impact of Bills of Rights, to simply focus on the role of the judiciary doesn't actually do justice to the way in which they can in very, very sweeping ways, make very big improvements to the lives of Australians.
My name is Roger Hills from Rethink Australia. My question is to Justice Kirby. As our organisation, Rethink Australia, is about promoting public discussion in Australia about how to look at our governance processes, how to have discussions about human rights issues and education and things like that, how to look at the good things about our constitution, but also the things that could be improved. What would you suggest how do you suggest we have that conversation? How do Australians, how do we as a citizenry, I suppose, get those discussions happening in such a way that we do have real depth rather than just media, 10-minute bites here and there, that people really start to think and start to discuss, well, what is our education system going to be like in 50 years' time? How do you want rights to be protected? What do you think would happen as far as that kind of area?
Well, first of all, and I have to say this, I'm not Justice Kirby anymore. In this country, you lose titles, and I support that. I mean, in America, you're always president this or governor that. Well, we don't do that. We're a democracy. The people give the title, and the people take it back. Secondly, in relation to the question, I have to say that I agree with Larissa. The real value of these instruments is that it improves process. And it improves process in a number of ways. First of all, there's been a study by academics in Victoria who've looked at how much school children know about rights in Massachusetts in the United States and Victoria in Australia. And they've found in Massachusetts they know quite a lot, and they get a paradigm, a framework for thinking about issues and being able to deal with issues in terms of basic concepts that they have to accord to other citizens as well as claim for themselves. But perhaps more apt for your question, in Victoria, the bureaucracy goes through the legislation and has to certify that the legislation is charter compliant. And recently there was a case about stop searches by police. And the bureaucracy certified that the charter was not complied with, and the minister then said, "Well, we justify enacting this. We realise it breaches the charter, but we say this is justified," and that makes it politically accountable. We have to raise the debate and make sure that our parliaments work better, and that I thought was the best idea in Professor Brennan's report from your university, that it made the Parliament more accountable. And don't think this is over, because the government said this will come back in 1914, which I remind my fellow citizens is on the brink of the celebration of the centenary of Gallipoli. We shouldn't be celebrating faraway wars of people who are lost in imperial ventures. We should be celebrating the acquisition of the recognition of the rights of all the people in this new suggestion of Professor Brennan.
Hello, I think we have our competition winner over here on the left. Peter from Perth, who won the Radio National Constitution competition.
Thank you very much, David. I want to return to a point that, Damien, you raised with several of the panellists in your interchange, which is the difficulty of achieving constitutional change through referenda. Now, there's a constitutional issue as to the way of promoting referenda, which is being looked at by a parliamentary committee. I think it's the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee of the Senate, but I'm sure Professor Craven would know something of the topic, and I wanted to direct the question to him particularly. Do you think that changing the procedures for promoting the Constitution, given your experiences in the promoting referenda, as you've referred to before, by changing the procedures we could improve the chances of achieving some realistic constitutional changes?
I mean, when we had the Republic thing, regardless of whether you're a Republican or a monarchist, when I was sort of running around trying to get it up, and it was very, very obvious very quickly, like from day one, that it wasn't going to get up, you did think quite a lot about why do people vote no, and the record is very strong. I mean, it's, I think, 44 referenda and 36 no's. There are various patterns in there that you can explain a lot. For example, the ones that fail are the ones giving power to the Commonwealth. So if you want to put one up that will fail, best chance, give power to Canberra. So for what it's worth, federalism tends to be supported by the Australian people at referenda. But the thing that goes much, much deeper than that I've thought of, and I mean there's no self-interest in this, it just seems to me this is roughly how it works, is something like this. First of all, the Australian people have a general conviction that to the extent that they've ever heard of their constitution, it's pretty good and going okay. And they assess that by reference to the fact that the army is not at any point rolling through the streets of Canberra. The police are not attacking the Building of the Age newspaper, the sort of things that happen when constitutions go wrong, that the Queen has not dissolved Parliament. That's their starting point, and it means that they're not very motivated for constitutional change. The second point is this, that if you get to that point, then the burden of proof that they impose becomes very, very high. And for example, what I think they basically get to is this. They'll vote yes if you can absolutely prove to them that there is not the slightest possibility that anything will go wrong with this change. In other words, it's like a jury trial. You never try and prove your client innocent because normally they're not. You just try and worry the jury enough that they're not 100% sure that he did it. And I think that's pretty much the way it works with referenda. And I think it applies indifferently to all sorts of referenda. I mean, it applies to republics, it applies to rights, it applies to giving power to the Commonwealth. Technical things slightly easier, but I'm not sure, I suppose the specific answer is, I'm not sure there's a great deal you can do about that, because this comes back to Carmen's point. These questions are not just questions of law, they're fundamental questions of political psychology.
The last referendum to get through made judges retire at 70.
And the most spectacular losses appear to have been when the two major political tendencies were on opposite sides of the argument. I think we shouldn't dismiss that as a potential influence.
And they almost always will be, because an opposition will almost always see a referendum as a perfect opportunity to beat up a government. So no one, I think, should ever have any doubts that any referendum is going to be easy.
And I think it's ultimately one of the grave weaknesses of our political system that we have such opposition. The bipolar system is not serving us well.
Well, on that happy note, I'm afraid that's all we have time for this evening. But the future of our Constitution is a vitally important issue, and it's a conversation we should all be part of. In aid of that goal, the Speaker's papers will be published on the National Archives website, where all Australians can express their views on the Constitution. Look for Constitution, have your say. Would you please help me thank our terrific speakers tonight, a former High Court Judge, the Honourable Michael Kirby, Vice-Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University, Professor Greg Craven, former WA Premier and Federal MP, Professor Carmen Lawrence, and Professor of Law and Indigenous Studies at the University of Technology, Sydney, Larissa Berendt.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.